Perfect. And I will introduce Mesha Santos, who is going to give us a brief overview of Anticlone. And once that's over, we'll move on to hear from each of the 4 themes of Anticlone and about what they're doing. And we'll move into a discussion together about any questions, and as well as having a chat about how Anticlone can best support EMCRs moving forward. We'll also, of course, you can ask questions between the presentations, so don't feel shy. We'll give you the option to do that as well if you've got any specific questions about anything that has been said. We've also got a bunch of doodle poll questions to help with engagement. We really want to hear your thoughts, and we know it's easy to answer polls, so we'll ask them throughout the session as well. All right, and without further ado, I will introduce one of our Chief Officers of Anticlone, Mercedes Santos, and over to you, Mesha.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening to everyone, and thank you very much for being here. As Jasmine mentioned, we wanted to have this engagement meeting with all of you, the young researchers. We think that might be of interest for big interest for all of you. So I will do a short introduction and then leave the room for my colleagues to go into details into the research themes. So So Antarctic and Southern, Antarctic and the Southern Ocean environments are facing increasing pressure from multiple threats. And with this program, we are looking forward to foster, facilitate, and coordinate high-quality transdisciplinary research to support and inform conservation and management of Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, and the subantarctic. The proposed research will build on work conducted under the existing generation of SRPS, and we will see soon more about it. But fundamentally, the research outputs will be used to inform contemporary and future decisions making regarding the environmental management of Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, and the subantarctic. Importantly, this scientific research program will address fundamental science questions, including those that have been identified in the SCAR Horizon scan. But SCAR is playing a fundamental role in the Antarctic Treaty System as the primary provider of independent and objective scientific advice, and this is increasingly being recognized. At recent SCAR conference also, it has been shown that there is a significant portion of the community, in particular you, the younger researchers, that are interested in undertaking and collaborating on research that informs good conservation and management outcomes. In the Antarctic Treaty System, the advice of SCAR is widely recognized as independent and objective, and parties are often rely on this advice to help in decision making. A resolution was passed in 2019 to formally recognize and acknowledge the contribution of SCAR to these meetings. We have so far a diverse and enthusiastic planning program groups with different, and in this group we try the guiding principles for this group was to look for gender equity, geographic representations, to include early career researchers, and you see most of them are here in this, organizing this meeting. We wanted to have a transdisciplinary approach, because we are speaking about conservation, of course, and we go through a round of broad consultations to have this group and to achieve these objectives. And which are these objectives are our overarching objectives is to facilitate and coordinate high quality science, to inform and to help to directly answer fundamental science questions, including those identified in the SCAR Horizon scan, as well as emerging questions identified by the science community and policymakers. The science will inform decision makers and drive international policy response and effective management of the Antarctic environment. This does not necessarily mean that all science undertaken under this program will be policy driven. There will be some key policy drivers, but just as importantly, there will be a place for pure science. And one of the components of these programs will be to identify connections between this science and environmental management and conservation. Some of our key specific objectives include to increase awareness of contemporary and future environmental issues in Antarctica and the Southern Oceans, identify vulnerable species, ecosystems, and environments, and identify and quantify threats and inform the development of practical mitigation strategies. So if we are interested in improving environmental outcomes for Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, there are some key end users that we need to target. And these include the Antarctic Treaty parties, the members of the Committee on Environmental Protection, the members of the Scientific Committee for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, and various or several international and national bodies. So we want to facilitate dynamic responses to emerging priorities issues by improving iterative discussions between scientists and policymakers. And we want to develop and maintain very close links to SCATS, which is key aspect of these interactions. Our colleague will speak about this research team, so I just will move through these slides. Sorry, and then I want to highlight that we are having important links with existing initiatives that are part of, that you already know, that are mentioned here in this slide, or you can see in the slides. We have been conducting several steering committee meetings. We have a mailing list to participate, where you can send a request to participate. We have the social sites to follow our work, the progress of our works. And we also are discussing think meetings to identify priority research areas and activities. And our plans now, with this pandemic has been a little complicated, but we are planning to have training workshops and to provide fellowship for young researchers, and to, I would say, increase our communications and outreach regarding this program. These are some of the milestones that we plan to have a steering committee to give, or to, sorry, I don't find the word, to have these community engagement meetings. One of the ideas is to establish, or to have a workshop with stakeholders, also with researchers and stakeholders, to identify the key priority questions that stakeholders may have. And then to increase the representation of young researchers into these meetings like the CEP or Camera Commission, scientific committee, to give you the opportunity to know how the discussions about science and in relation to management are being developed. So these are the next steps in the following years. And with this, I leave you the floor to my colleagues to explain a little more about the research themes. Will it stop sharing?
Thanks a lot, Mecha. I wanted to just introduce myself real quick. I'm Steve Chignell. I'm an EMCR for the theme 3. And maybe before we go forward, is there any questions from the audience based off of that introduction? Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, yeah, sorry. I just, I'll hold my microphone up. Yeah, I'm Steve Chignell. I'm the EMCR rep for theme 3. I just want to say thanks for that introduction and ask if there are any questions before we move forward.
That's all right, no questions at the start, I guess. Everyone's feeling shy. So we can move on to the next theme, but before we do that, of course, if you have any questions, keep them noted down and ask them later on. And just to get us all warmed up this morning or evening, for most of you, we'll launch the first poll. So this should be super easy. We just want to know whether or not you've been involved in a SCAR group either now or in the past. Perfect. Hopefully most of you can see the poll. Right, almost everyone's answered, so I'll stop it there. Right, so hopefully you can all see that. So we can see that most people have not been involved in a previous SCAR group, which is really exciting. So hopefully you can get involved in an icon. And we've got a few that have been involved in the past or are involved currently. So that's a good start. I'll stop sharing that. And I will now introduce our next speaker, who will present our Theme 1 overview, and that is one of our EMCRs. I'll pass over to Gilda Kakavo.
All right, thanks, Jasmine. I will set up my screen share. All righty. Hold on. Okay, can you tell me if you're seeing presenter view or the slide?
We're seeing presenter view.
Let's see what happens when I do that. How
Perfect.
about now?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. I'm just going to move the, okay. Perfect. So my name is Gilda Kakavo. I'm the early mid-career rep for the research theme 1, which is of Anticon, which is current state and future projections of Antarctic systems, species, and functions. I'm working with Heather Lynch and Antonio Quesada. Heather Lynch is actually at the meeting here now to manage this theme. And it's quite broad, so there's a lot of different things that we want to work on here. Heather Lynch tends to work on sort of more large scale fauna, more marine environmental researcher. Antonio works down on very small levels of fauna, even to the level of viruses, and is more of a freshwater terrestrial researcher. I work on fish and on the sort of population level around Antarctica. And so all of us sort of represent different corners of what this theme could represent, and we're sort of trying to work together to make it all that it can be. So these are just a list of some of the key questions that we're trying to address, given that there's such a wide overview that this theme could include. So for example, how vulnerable are different species, ecosystems, and environments? So the first thing is this question of scales. So to what extent do we have change over scales in terms of years to decades? To what extent do we have change in terms of scales that are local, regional, or even circumpolar? What are the projected impacts of multiple stressors, be they human activities, climate change, non-native species on Antarctica, and Southern Ocean species? And again, that question is scale, from species to populations to ecosystems and environments. Identifying the key drivers is going to be another large part of the things that we're going to cover in the theme. And the identification of tipping points. So the extent to which different species, ecosystems, and environments are resilient, what are their thresholds to exhibiting change or suffering from the drivers that we identify, and to what extent, most importantly, are some of these tipping points irreversible or not? And finally, the role of Antarctic species, ecosystems, and environments in mitigating global change. So this is the sort of connectivity between Antarctica and the global system, and how might that change the changes incurred from the different drivers develop over future timescales. So first, the idea is that we don't want to necessarily reinvent the wheel with this theme. So of course, SCAR projects have been running for over 30 years now, and they've all wanted to address this baseline. And that's, we're continuing in that theme to an extent. We want to identify what resources exist already in terms of data on Antarctic biodiversity distributions and abundances. What we want to do, and we don't want to repeat efforts that have already been done. There's tons of fantastic reviews out there on biodiversity in Antarctica. But the thing about most of these reviews is that they're focusing on published data. And what we want to do in theme 1 of Anticon is delve into the unpublished materials. So there's so many monitoring programs going on in different national research programs. And these are they're generating data that are often not being published because they're not hypothesis testing, they're not very sexy results. And so they're not amenable to the current publishing atmosphere. And so what we want to do is we want to pull out all of these data, which will be incredibly useful to inform all of the questions relevant to this theme. Digitize them, distribute them to researchers. And, so that's seeing what's out there. And then we ultimately want to make it such that that previous step becomes less and less relevant. We want to work with different journals and data depositories to make it such that monitoring data that's collected is becoming more and more part of the general published milieu, so that there's much more accessibility to the data that's out there from monitoring programs. So this is this three-pronged approach that was envisioned for theme 1. Identify the resources that are out there, bring that unpublished data out, digitize it, distribute it, and then create an environment in which that sort of data can be more accessible in the future. And so the community, and which include all of you here, are what data do you have access to? So to what extent, and this is something that we are going to go to the community about and have already started to see where are those sources of unpublished data on distribution and abundance of Antarctic taxa. What are the barriers that exist to that kind of data sharing? Now, mind you, given the Antarctic Treaty System and the fact that all data should be available to all members doing research in Antarctica, there shouldn't be any barriers. However, things like language, for example, or accessibility to data in certain forgotten databases or what have you, could be the types of barriers that are preventing these information to be available to everyone. So these are the type of things that we'd like to identify in order to reduce those barriers in the future. And then the question, of course, comes to the types of taxa that have the most pressing data gaps. So obviously, this list can go on, and this is just a brief taste of that. And indeed, we cite, birds and seals, whereas when we talk about marine invertebrates, that represents thousands of phyla that in one, list here. So of course, different species and taxa will have different types of data gaps. And so part of the goal here is to really identify where those gaps are, to present this to the research community as goals for their future research. And this is my last slide. So this was really brief, but here I want to talk a bit more about the types of the next steps and the ways in which you can get involved with the particular aspects of theme 1 in Anticon. So some of the things that theme 1 is looking to do in terms of next steps are identify individuals and institutions that are interested in contributing to our efforts. So you can do that by subscribing to the mailing list or reaching out to Heather, Antonio, or I. We want to identify taxa specialists who would be fantastic resources in identifying data gaps and the existing data that isn't published for certain species of interest. We'd like to create some sort of repository of existing data, but note, working with the many repositories that already exist, and also the other organizations that have similar goals to our own. So I cite here in particular the Antarctic Biodiversity Portal, which is a SCAR product, the efforts of the Southern Ocean Decade, part of the UN Decade of Ocean Science, SEUS, which is part of SCAR, the Southern Ocean Observing System, and finally, the Marine Ecosystem Assessment of the Southern Ocean. The URL there is actually is a short version of the Frontiers website, which shows the special issue of Frontiers that this MISO, for short, Marine Ecosystem Assessment of the Southern Ocean, compiled. And this is essentially a group of 30 or more papers looking to assess the ecosystem in Southern Ocean ecosystem and identify gaps. So again, in a very similar way to what we're trying to do in Anticon, but with a marine focus. So these are all efforts that we're going to be working in collaboration with, again, not wanting to reinvent the wheel. And then the most important thing I wanted to point out is that we want to get started a monthly seminar series. It's going to be started a bit in which we will highlight a taxa of the month, and we'll have a speaker who has research particularly relevant to that taxa to be giving a seminar to the Anticon community and SCAR community. But this seminar series will evolve over time. So we'd be really happy to get suggestions of topics, themes, and suggestions of speakers such as yourself for this series. So one, keep an eye out for news about the start of that seminar series. And two, feel free to get in touch with us if you'd like to see seminars on certain topics, if you'd like to suggest speakers, or if you'd even like to suggest yourself. And I think I will wrap it up there. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone might have.
Yeah, so feel free to drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself.
And I just saw your message, Lewis, in the chat. So that sounds fantastic. We will definitely connect after this meeting because we don't want to, again, be reinventing the wheel. If there's folks that are already working on this and you've been working with Heather and Antonio, it'll be really cool to have you part of this conversation.
We'll move on to the next theme speaker and the next poll. So thanks for that, Jutta, again. All right, for our next poll, I'll launch that now. We want to know what career stage you're in. Now, if you're not an EMCR anymore, you don't need to answer this one. I will just wait for the answers to keep coming in. All right, and they seem to have stopped, so I'll share the results with that. Right, so we can see we've got a pretty good mix across the EMCR range at the meeting today, which is great. So it's almost, the most is postdocs greater than 5 years, which is awesome. Of course, we'd love to have all of you involved in Anticon, and a few masters and PhD students, and yes, quite a few postdocs. So welcome to everyone. Stop sharing that. All right, and I will now introduce our speaker for theme 2, who is Kevin Hughes at the British Antarctic Survey. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen, see if we can get this to work. Right then. Come on. Can everybody see that in sort of useful format? Great. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm going to talk about research theme 2, which is about human impacts and sustainability. And I'm talking as one of the co-theme leaders for this theme, along with Jasmine Lee, who's hosting the meeting with great aplomb, and also Andrew Lowther. So what's the situation we find ourselves in? Well, this has been touched on earlier, but in essence, Antarctica and the Southern Ocean are becoming increasingly busy due to fishing activities, tourism, the industry, science, and also the science support activities that are provided by the national Antarctic programs. And despite existing efforts, we are causing impacts upon the Antarctic environment. Policymakers have called out for the best available science to inform their decision-making concerning the protection of the environment. And in many cases, it's down to people in SCAR, people like yourselves, to try and provide that information if that's within the sort of science that you do. So research theme 2 is trying to answer the questions the policymakers have. And we've got some key questions that we are trying to kind of put some flesh on. So the first is, what is the current and what are projected future extents of human activities in Antarctica? What is our footprint? What are we doing? Secondly, what are the primary risks related to these activities? And how can risks and impacts be mitigated? And can we identify some solutions to try and make the situation better? We've got a range of research tools at our disposal. We can work on baseline monitoring, and that's already been covered to a large degree by research theme 1. We can undertake ecosystem assessments. We can look at projective models, what's going to happen in the future to try and see where we're going. And we can use conservation planning tools to try and give the policymakers something solid to actually grasp hold of to make their decisions. And one thing that's extremely important is that we have very good stakeholder engagement so that we can get that science right the way through to the policy, that make that link and get that information across to make a difference. So we've got various threats that are affecting the region. Firstly, climate change and human footprint. That figure on the right is basically the warming of Antarctica under a high emission scenario, and it's not looking great, as I'm sure you'll agree. So the non-uniform effects of climate change are becoming increasingly apparent across the continent and the Southern Ocean. And we've got questions, and these are: what are the synergistic and cumulative impacts of human activities combined with other change drivers, including climate change? Which areas are most vulnerable to the impacts associated with an expanding human footprint? We see a lot of activity in the Antarctic Peninsula, in the Ross Sea region, and various other oases in East Antarctica, but it's going to get greater potentially. How can we most effectively use existing management tools to protect Antarctic species and habitats? And we've already got quite good use of the protected area system, and we can also potentially designate more specially protected species, for example. So talk about fishing now. So commercial exploitation of Antarctic and Patagonian toothfish, Antarctic krill, mackerel icefish occurs throughout the Southern Ocean, but it is often very much localized in some particular regions. And the questions are things like, well, how are these activities likely to impact upon the marine ecosystems? And really, we do need effective monitoring to provide appropriate scientific advice for managing these fishing activities. And I think we're quite well placed to provide that information. So just to that graph on the left, it shows that harvesting rates are now at their highest levels since records began. And what we're seeing is an increasing focus and concentration of things like the krill industry in very, very specific locations rather than spread across the ocean. So these do have quite important implications for the stocks that are there. We're interested in pollution, whether that's broad-scale pollution or very much focused around particular local areas. So we've got questions like, what is the susceptibility of microbial and macroscopic species to these contaminants, whatever they happen to be: oil, sewage, metals, plastics, you name it? How can we minimize contaminant release and help clean up contaminated sites, like really applied science? And how will climate change affect exposure of species and ecosystems to these contaminants? Disturbance and damage to flora and fauna is another important area of research. Questions we've got are, what are the impacts of visitors on wildlife, and are they cumulative? We're seeing increasing levels of tourism activity in the region, and it's an increasingly important question. Also, what are the effects of trampling and damage on terrestrial communities, and how quickly can they recover? And also, how can we quantify the impacts on vulnerable marine ecosystems as a result of fishing activities? And finally, non-native species. This is potentially one of the biggest threats to terrestrial communities in Antarctica, but also marine communities. And we've got questions like, which terrestrial and marine regions and habitats are most at risk from non-native species introductions, including pathogens? And I think some of the research that's been done around COVID and the potential to transfer that to wildlife is a very good example of the sort of thing that we can research to give advice to the policymakers. But also, what are the risks and pathways for the transfer of terrestrial and marine species within Antarctica? And this is the idea of intra-regional transfer, of moving species within the continent. So that's just a kind of a very quick gallop through of the sort of questions that we're interested in and the sort of research that we want to be able to provide to policymakers so they can make good decisions. So if you're involved in these sorts of things, if you're interested, please do get in touch. You can contact me or Andy or Jasmine, and we'd love to hear what you're doing. Ultimately, we need a good sort of good body of scientists to really deliver this work. And yes, let's just get on with it, basically. So thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Kevin. Any questions for Kevin before we move on? Oh, Jasmine, we can't hear you. Jasmine, are you unmuted? Okay, well, no questions. Let's launch the next.
Wait, sorry, Luis wants to make a question.
Oh, great. Okay, please, Luis. Sorry, we missed you.
Hi. It's not really a question, it's just a suggestion. Maybe it's a small point, but in this theme in particular, where this language decays so fast and there's this massive amount of terminology, I will suggest bringing into the board guest participants outside of Antarctica and give us some seminars, either guesting people invited from EMCRs, or I can name a lot of organizations and themes at the moment. But I guess, yeah, it's just a small suggestion, like try to develop some joint seminars and bring the bridge between Antarctica and the rest of the world closer. But this is just a small suggestion.
Yeah, great point. Thanks, Luis. Okay, so if there's no more questions, maybe it's a good time to move on to the next poll. So I'm going to launch this very quickly. So in this one, we're curious to know what your field of research looks like. So what's the distribution of where we're all coming from in our training? So please go ahead and fill that out. Okay, almost everyone's participated. Oh, very interesting. So dominated this meeting by the life sciences. Very interesting. Physical sciences coming in with a couple people, and social sciences and humanities following it up. No one from the geosciences. Interesting. These are kind of complicated categories anyway, so I suppose maybe some issue with how people define themselves, but very interesting. Okay, and with that, I think we want to switch into research theme 3, which is socio-ecological approaches to Antarctic and Southern Ocean conservation. And this is led by Daniela Liggett and Adrian Hawkins, with me as the EMCR. So I'll hand it over to them.
Thank you, Steve. Let me just bring up my slides. Can you see that? Let's turn to presenter view. Okay, welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many of you here who we've already had quite a lot of offline discussions over the last weeks, months, and years. Our research theme deals with the socio-ecological approaches and the socio-ecological connections with human activities and human stories, human memories over time. We, as Steve already said, are a team of 3 at the moment, Adrian, Steve, and myself. We're all on the call, and we are going to swap and change a bit in terms of presenters. Our key research questions essentially try to place human use and human stories and engagements with the Antarctic in alongside those environmental changes that we are seeing. We are trying to take a different look at socio-ecological resilience in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And we try to take into consideration, as in question 1 pointed out here, those socio-political and economic impacts that have environmental consequences for the Antarctic. And there we really need to link up to research theme 2 as well, because obviously research theme 2 is analyzing human impacts and the role that human impacts has played over time within the Antarctic region. We are also tasked to look at what responsible and ethical governance for Antarctica would look like in the next century, and in this century, of course. And as such, we need to take into consideration ethical issues around what kind of rights we also give to the features of a region, non-human life, as well as obviously how we have used the region in the past and what kind of stories and memories remain. So as such, we do need to look at human use over time and the cultural meaning that has been given to places as well, in order to be able to actually ensure a more equitable approach that takes sustainable management into consideration, but does keep in mind the current paradigm of Antarctic governance that essentially evolves around this natural reserve that has been designated by the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. We are still exploring how we approach those topics, but essentially, we do also need, as in question 4 here, think about what kind of implications global shifts, political, social, economic shifts, as well as we've currently seen with the COVID-19 pandemic in particular, health issues, future pandemics, what kind of implications would these shifts have for our human engagement with the Antarctic, as well as for the Antarctic ecosystems and environments? As such, we will look at the linkages between the ecosystem dynamics and the work that is being done in the other themes, as well as our human use and human histories with the Antarctic, socioeconomic and cultural values that are being associated with our engagement with the Antarctic region. And then policy and management practices that are in place to actually ensure that those values, not just the environmental values, but also the socioeconomic and cultural values, are being balanced and are taking into consideration those global shifts that we are going to see. We do want to build on current frameworks and the work that has already been done by Alex Thoreau's and many others around the concept of Antarctic conservation biogeographical regions, where different regions in the Antarctic have been classified according to their biogeographical features. We do want to extend that framework because we realize that actually human interactions with the Antarctic are changing Antarctic environments and are also changing humans themselves. So we do need to take into consideration social and cultural engagements and also social pressures for the Antarctic region. So we propose to move from this concept of biogeographic regions, which almost looked at Antarctica in isolation and considered the different ecosystem factors, but did not really take into consideration human use of the regions to the extent that it possibly should do, and broaden that concept to look at it as a biocultural regional lens. And we do want to use an approach that Steve will actually outline, critical physical geography.
Yeah, thanks, Daniela. So, yeah, this approach, critical physical geography, or CPG for short, it's an emerging framework and field coming out of geography, but really it's all about combining any biophysical science with close attention to sociocultural dynamics, and including in the sociocultural dynamics the social aspect of scientific knowledge production. So in that way, it's trying to understand the world we live in. Basically it says if we accept the central premise of the Anthropocene, which is that the world around us is sort of socio-ecological hybrid, then our research must be too. And so it no longer makes sense to concentrate natural science research on pristine systems or to separate research into the natural sciences and social sciences. And so rather it tries to develop hybrid understandings of hybrid landscapes without sort of subsuming the social into the natural or the natural into the social. And in doing so, it sort of emphasizes mixed methods approach, which allows it to sort of sit between some of the epistemic tensions between natural and social sciences that often kind of prevent integrative work, and focused on reflexive practice. So this is in that term is sort of meant, it's from more the social sciences, but essentially reflecting on our own backgrounds and histories and positions, and how our own values we're bringing as researchers our own values to the science, and how that then affects the science, and trying to just make that upfront and clear, rather than trying to ignore it. So yeah, we're really excited about this, I think, because it's a new field that's got a lot of potential.
Thank you, Steve. And in line with the reflexive practice that Steve just mentioned, we have already run a few community meetings, bringing in a range of scholars from very different disciplines. And we, even within the social sciences and humanities, we realized that we do need to take into consideration and be much more appreciative of our own biases that we bring into the mix, and the way we see the world and the way we undertake research. And in order to get the most of the different expertise that can be brought to the table, we have decided to initially focus on a few comparative case studies that shall serve as our scoping studies to understand whether we can actually easily employ this biocultural lens to a couple of rather well-defined subregions within broader areas in the Antarctic. So we have a number of experts from the South Shetland Islands who look at tourism, for instance, archaeology, histories of human use in that area. And we know that the South Shetland Islands and the broader Antarctic Peninsula are obviously the hotspots of human activity in the Antarctic. And there again are some interesting linkages with research themes too, which we need to think about in the future. And then on the other side of the continent, we wanted to look at the McMurdo Dry Valleys, in their own right, key areas for human engagement, scientific engagement, as well as tourism, and the broader Ross Sea region, bringing in marine and terrestrial aspects and putting those regions at the focus of looking at our research questions, which I've just put in here, and taking different perspectives and looking at those questions across time and space. So we want to take into consideration, well, how has human use and human interaction of these areas developed over time? What were in the past economic engagements with the regions, and what were their consequences at the moment? What do we see of their remains? And then also, what are some of the intangible remains of human interactions with those areas, and how have they embedded themselves in the stories and memories, the heritage more broadly that we are engaging with, and that can create significant tension at the level of governance. So as next steps, we want to hold a series of workshops that address our research questions with a focus on those two broader regions, with those subregions being put under particular detailed analysis. And we do invite everyone who has some engagement with research that could address the different questions that are on the screen here, or take different perspectives into consideration with a focus on these two regions, to participate in those workshops, share their viewpoints. And in the end, we do want to pull the lessons learned together in a presentation at the SCAR Open Science Conference in 2022, and also a joint paper that everyone would be a co-author on, who contributes to those workshops and to pulling those lessons together. But I do want to put our email addresses up there again, and want to also hand over to everyone for questions, and to also Adrian, who's there, who might have to add something that I have missed.
I think you and Steve covered it really well. Thanks, Daniela. Thanks, Steve. But do ask us questions. Luis.
Hello, sorry for raising my thoughts, but I really like the idea, and I think it's important to include these socio-ecosystemic approaches in Antarctica. Just some critical thinking. Maybe we should do a poll between us on who took attending this meeting and where do we all come from. I don't think there's a large representation of all national programs participants in here. I'm not saying it's the fault of the organizers. I just say that somehow the community in Antarctica is not as connected as we tend to think sometimes, and maybe I'm thinking more of the Western, let's call it Western views. So I think particularly in the topic of socio-ecosystemic approaches, it's really important to have all the views, and Antarctica being such a diverse continent with so many cultural differences, think it's going to be critical to have the views from everybody. Very important to cover that it's a matter of engaging all cultural communities, as some of them are reluctant to participate, basically because different countries have different, how to express it, ways to control the public views or scientific views. So it's really important to have the views from everybody here in some way, not to meet a quota, but also to incorporate all these views. And even within the countries, there's a lot of heterogeneity we don't think about. We always think from a point of view, and we don't necessarily consider all the diversity out there. Like I grew in a department of ecology. There's classical ecology and socio-ecosystem studies. These people don't speak to each other. It's like two different languages within a department, right? So imagine scaling that to the world. So I guess here the biggest challenge will be to cover all the diversity of views, and I'll stop it here. Sorry. Happy to take part.
Thank you, Luis. We'll count on that on the last part. You're raising a good point, which essentially I think also echoes a bit of what Gabriela and Rebecca tried to address in the chat, and that's this really complex and complicated matter of engaging very different communities that come from different cultures and different languages and bring them together. And we know they speak different languages, and we know that this will be a key challenge. So in short, we are trying to reach out. And in response to Gabriela's question, I think taking an Indigenous lens on things, just like on so many other aspects of how world politics evolve, it would be really, really useful, because obviously, as we know, Indigenous peoples have a very different relationship with land and heritage and stories, and how stories and their relationship with the land can inform their way of interacting with it, and inform their way of taking care of it, more like guardians rather than those governors that we are typically seeing in the Western system. So it would be interesting. We haven't honestly really gone that deep yet. But since we do have a number of Indigenous scholars within New Zealand, for instance, and also thinking about reaching out to Arctic Canada and various parts of South America, if we could involve those scholars and get their viewpoints, I think that would be really, really important, and would probably enrich the discussions. In terms of how we see this as playing into conservation efforts, I think it is not just to contextualize them, because in the end, conservation efforts are going to be carried by people and by the decisions people make in the field, by how they behave, by whether they decide in the first place to go to the Antarctic or not, or try to engage with others to collect their data. So it's essentially human decision-making, human endeavors that shape conservation and ensure that the best intentions can actually be followed through by actions that align with those intentions. So I think we do always need to keep in mind how we engage with the Antarctic, how we have engaged with it over time, what worked, what didn't work, what ended up shaping our stories and histories, which is very different from what events actually really may have unfolded in a certain way, as we know. So we do hope that the work here, links to a multitude of different perspectives, including Indigenous perspectives and those from the global South, and B, tries to really link to conservation efforts and possibly also shape them. Adrian, Steve?
I think you covered that brilliantly, Daniela. Just to say, I suppose, I think we're getting towards the end of our time for Research Theme 3, but please do get in touch. So we're going to have these series of workshops, and they're pretty big regions, the Ross Sea region and the Antarctic Peninsula. So if you've got connections to those places and ideas about this, we'd really welcome your input. So get in touch with Steve or Daniela or myself, and we can include you in those workshops over the next few months.
Thank you. I'll mute my microphone. Oh, there's a longer message. Sorry, Gilda, I couldn't see the chat when I was having my screen up.
Perfect. Sorry for my audio issues this morning. Can you all hear me now okay? Okay, great. So thank you for those questions. They're really interesting. And of course, continue to tuck more in the chat. That's been really useful. So our next poll will actually be after our fourth theme introduction. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Natasha Gardner, who's going to introduce the synthesis theme for everyone.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'll just share my screen. Oh. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, cool. All right, well, hi everyone. I'm very excited to be introducing and speaking on behalf of Anticon's synthesis theme, which is a little bit of a tongue twister. And the theme includes our two theme leads, Hyung-Shul Shin from the Korean Polar Research Institute, Neil Gilbert, who's an independent consultant here in New Zealand, and myself, Natasha Gardner, as the EMCR for the theme, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Canterbury. So our theme is all about working on the issue of integrating and synthesizing the research that's being undertaken and helping to effectively deliver this into the Antarctic treaty system. So as Metcha mentioned in the beginning, working collaboratively with the policy and management is no new thing for SCAR, and SCAR's actually got a very long history of doing just that. So for about 6 decades now, SCAR has been providing independent and high quality scientific advice into the treaty system. And on the right of the screen, we've just put up the Prague Declaration, which was signed in 2019 by the treaty parties. And the declaration basically just recognises and puts significant emphasis on the importance of Antarctic research, and not just for science's sake or for using, Antarctica as this global laboratory, but actually to underline the importance of scientific research for the purpose of informing Antarctic management and effective governance. And there was another declaration signed in Paris this year that was to the very similar ilk. So this just really shows that the Antarctic treaty parties do see Antarctic research as extremely important to their work, and they truly value SCAR's input into the system. So this central and very respected role that SCAR plays means that we have a really strong basis for making sure that the science that's being undertaken is having an impact on the policy. And the opportunity for us in the synthesis theme is to build on this really strong foundation. So our theme plans to identify and map out the conservation objectives that require scientific input to achieve those objectives. But what's really exciting and key as well is that we're really interested to look at identifying some of those future and emerging challenges that perhaps may not yet be on the policy agenda, but might appear as issues at some point in the near to long future. So how can we anticipate those issues now so that our science community is prepared to provide advice on those when they come up later? And making sure that there's good alignment between the research that's being undertaken and how and when that information is being delivered to the policy realm is also really important and something that we'll be focusing on. So we'll be taking a slightly more strategic and future focused approach. But before I kind of continue on with our themes plans, we thought it might be really good just to give a very, very brief overview of how SCAR is actually providing advice into the system. Disclaimer, this is a very simplified diagram, but it might help give a little bit of context to what I'm actually talking about. So I don't know if you can see my cursor. But SCAR obviously in the middle here, and SCAR has a bunch of research programs and expert action groups and all sorts of groups that are working on a variety of different research areas. And but in terms of the science policy interaction into the system, SCAR has the Standing Committee on the Antarctic Treaty System, and also known as SCATS. And SCATS is pretty much the face of SCAR within the treaty system, and it's SCATS' role to develop SCAR's advice and deliver this into the various policy arenas that you can see at the bottom there. And so you'll notice there's lots of two-way arrows in this diagram, and that's kind of representing that SCAR provides two types of advice. So the first is solicited advice. So the policy community might ask SCAR to investigate particular issues and provide information on particular issues, and SCAR will deliver to that. But there's also the opposite way, where SCAR will actually provide advice on issues that SCAR sees as really important and that the policy community needs to know about. So examples would include those emerging issues that I just mentioned earlier. But in terms of what the policy community want to know, there are a number of plans available, and you can see over to the left there, the Committee on Environmental Protection has a couple of work plans. So they've got the 5-year work plan and also the Climate Change Response Work Programme. And these both outline key policy issues and also the research priorities for those issues. And as well, the Scientific Committee to CAMLA has similar work plans within their various working groups. So the science community do have some guidance already to work from in terms of what information is needed. So the key message there is that it's a very two-way interaction between SCAR and the policy community. And the way SCAR actually delivers its advice into the treaty system in the middle here, so you can see these bullet points. So SCAR can submit working papers and information papers. SCAR also delivers a lecture on a priority topic annually at the ATCM. And there's also the Antarctic Environments Portal, which is accessible all year round and includes short research summaries aimed at the policy community. So if you haven't had a look on that already, I highly recommend you have a look. Said this is a very simplified diagram, and it definitely doesn't include all of the routes by which science moves through the system. For example, you have scientists sitting on national delegations who are also providing science advice, and you have a whole range of experts who are also communicating science advice to the policy community. So that's a very brief summary, and I hope it kind of gives a little bit of context to what I'll be talking about. So back to our theme, these are some of our guiding questions that were posed in ICON's original implementation plan, and they are no small questions, but really the main aim for us is to gain an understanding of how SCAR can effectively deliver to the key conservation objectives for Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, and making sure that good quality science is being communicated in the right way at the right time so as to maximise that policy impact. And to do that, we need to understand what scientific outputs need to be integrated and synthesized to inform decision making. And that's not just for an ICON science outputs, but also across SCAR's other research programs. So we're going to be working with the other SRPs as well. Another key question for us is how can we assist in communicating uncertainty? Often the policy community like certainty on the basis of making their decisions, and as we all know, Antarctic science comes with many inherent uncertainties. So how can we communicate that better and foster a mutual understanding between the science and policy communities? And lastly, how can we make sure that the science is targeted so it's being delivered, as I mentioned earlier, in the right way at the right time? So these are some of the opportunities that we've identified so far, and we're very keen to explore within this synthesis group. And firstly, we want to foster collaborations with key knowledge providers and key stakeholders. And there will be a whole range of ways we can do that through things like joint workshops, targeted presentations, and identifying various collaborative work streams, as well as potentially running a seminar series leading up to those important policy meetings that are targeted at the policy community. And yeah, so we also want to develop specialist expertise on research communication, and we know that there are a number of SCAR groups already working in this space, so we're very keen to engage with those as well. And there's not only an opportunity to assist the delivery of information into the policy realm, but also in the opposite direction. So bringing the policy and information needs from the policy community back to the science community so that the scientists know how they can better deliver to that. And last but not least, which is probably most relevant to many of you here today, we want to take the opportunity to engage with the early to mid-career community and understand and help EMCRs understand how to undertake policy relevant research. And we also want to find ways to incentivize that. So we've come up with various ideas, including training events for EMCRs, but we're very keen to hear your ideas as well. So hopefully we can have a discussion about that at the end. So these are our next steps that we are planning to take, and we've already made some progress towards some of these. So firstly, we're looking at mapping out the current policy and management needs. And as I mentioned earlier, there are already a number of plans that we can draw from, like the CEP work plan and from the various scientific committee to CAMLA work groups. So we're looking to pull key information out of those and map them out so that the research community can have a really good understanding of what the current policy interests are and also into the future. We want to develop a strategic engagement plan so that we can, again, look ahead to the future meetings and anticipate what science might be needed. And to do that, we need to build a really strong network and partnerships. And of course, we need to work across the SCAR groups and most importantly as well with SCATs. So as I've already discussed, SCATs is the mechanism by which science is being delivered into the treaty system, and we need to make sure that our work plan is aligned with the work of SCATs. And we can kind of act as this sort of engine room sitting behind SCATs, ensuring that they are receiving the best information to then be delivered into that policy realm. And again, taking that future-looking approach will be really key for us. This slide is basically just to demonstrate how the synthesis themes as well. So we're very much a cross-cutting theme, and we are hoping we can provide this kind of connecting framework across all of the research themes within an icon, as well as throughout other SCAR groups. And here we've just put this slide up just to acknowledge the fact that there already is a huge amount of information out there that is policy relevant and really useful for the policy community, but it can be quite daunting for policy people to trawl through the academic literature. And so this synthesis group really provides that nice mechanism for synthesizing all of this key information and ensuring that that's being put into a digestible form that then can be delivered to the policy people. So that's pretty much me, and this is us. And yeah, really keen to hear all of your thoughts. And as I say, we're currently in that phase of kind of building up our network. So if you are interested in this theme, please absolutely get in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Natasha. Any questions on that?
Well, that's all right. If there's no questions, we can save them for the end and for our bit of a discussion, which we're going to launch now. So we'll kick that off with a couple of poll questions. Maybe that will help kind of feed the discussion. So this one I'll launch now. Is we want to know what theme, now that you've heard about all the themes, what theme do you feel that your research, your interests are most aligned with? And Lewis has said in the chat that this is an unfair question. You can actually put multiple answers in if you would like to, but it might be too late if most people have already answered. All right, I'll just give everyone another few seconds, just a couple more left. Right, I think that's mostly everyone. Right, I will share those results. Interestingly, it's like not a bad spread. We've probably got, you know, the most people interested in research in theme 1, and then a pretty even spread across the other 3 themes. So that's very interesting. And of course, I assume some of you answered for multiple themes as well. All right, now before I open the next poll, are there any questions for any of the speakers so far, or general Anticon questions or anything like that? If you want to know anything about Anticon or any of the themes, feel free to put it in the chat or speak up. Nothing. That's okay. If you do have anything, of course. Oh, hang on. No, that's Natasha replying. If you do have anything, continue to just put your hand up or put them in the chat, and I'll open our next poll, because this is one of the important things we wanted to do today, is that we want to hear more about how the EMCR community feels that they could be supported by Anticon. So as Natasha was alluding to before. So we'll start with a couple of poll questions to kick that discussion off, but we'd really love to hear from you about how you would like to be involved and how we can support you in doing that. All right, so this poll has got 3 questions. I'm launching it now. So the first question is about opportunities from Anticon for EMCRs, and then about funding, and then about what kind of training interests you most. And of course, if you've got an answer that's not on there, just chuck it in the chat. All right, there we go. And as Lewis has said in the chat, theme 1 does have some broad aims. I mean, I think across Anticon, we've still got some broad aims, and we will start to narrow them down as time goes, I suppose. So while I let you finish answering that question, there might be still a couple more answers to come in. Ali has asked in the chat if there is an official way to communicate what we're working on to others so that we can work with each other and support related research. That is a great question, Ali. Anyone else can feel free to jump in and add to what I have to say. But what we are setting up is on the SCAR website, we're setting up a Anticon kind of profile page so that you can, once we've got that worked out, everyone will be able to like upload their own kind of bio and photo to that page, so you can look across all of the researchers that are interested in being involved in Anticon, and yeah, potentially hopefully find some collaborations and support related research. Has anyone else got anything to add to that question? No? All right, well, I'll finish the poll and then we can move on to other questions. All right, so to share results, hopefully you can all see that now. What we found for opportunities, what opportunities would you like Anticon to provide to EMCRs? It seems like it's a pretty even spread across all of them. So everyone's interested in networking, training and workshops, mentoring and funding. So all good things to focus on. How do you feel that Anticon should use their funding to support EMCRs? This is actually quite interesting. So we've got travel support, which is kind of what a lot of the SRPs have done in the past, like supporting travel to conferences and stuff. But the most people actually said small research grants, as well as EMCR workshops. So that's interesting. If you've got any other ideas, please do put them in the chat. And finally, what kind of training most interests you? That's also a pretty even spread about kind of understanding that science policy interface, data access and integration, and the socio-ecological approaches. And of course, anything else can go in the chat. All right, well, hopefully that can help us kick off our discussion, but maybe we can answer this first question first from Rebecca. She said, how are the findings from the Southern Ocean Decade workshop groups going to play into all of this? And I guess specifically the synthesis theme where you try to map priorities. So does anyone want to answer that?
Yeah, I can just very briefly speak to that. Just move that poll. There we go. Yes, thank you, Rebecca. That's a really great point. And Hyung-Shul and I both attended the Southern Ocean Decade workshops. I think that was last week. And we're definitely keen to reach out. So that's on our list of, you know, groups that we need to be collaborating with. So yeah, that's a really good point.
All right, thanks, Natasha. Has anyone got anything to add to that? No. All right, so back to our polling questions and our like kind of how Anticlone can best support EMCRs. Does anyone want to speak to this or like potentially put other ideas in the chat or anything? Because we're really keen to try and get all of you involved. And there's lots of, I think there's lots of faces here and names that of potential of all EMCRs. So it'd be great to hear your thoughts.
I was just kind of keen, sorry.
Yeah, go Natasha.
Just I was quite excited to see at in the question and the poll about people being interested about the science policy interface. Woohoo! That's really exciting. And so we have kind of been thinking about ideas, say if we were to run some EMCR workshops about potentially, you know, what people would actually want to know. And some of those ideas is like, for example, how to write summaries for the Antarctic Environments portal, or contributing to like working papers and ASPER management plans and learning more about kind of the treaty language and how you can write, because it's quite a particular way that the treaty parties kind of receive their information, the language that they use. But also, is it kind of that you want to learn just generally how science is informing the policy realm? So I would be really interested to hear more from the community what parts of that you would be really keen to learn more about so that we can definitely set those things up. Lewis?
Hi. Just a small note, following with the poll results, I noticed the relevance given to early careers, travel grants and small funding. I just want to say that it's a shame that SCAR fellowships are so few, because there's so good applications every year. I've been a reviewer a few times, and it's quite sad not to have all them funded. I think because this meeting is about early and mid-career, we are here, and it's a good proportion of mid-careers, but I will say there's not so many early career, and that's natural because early careers don't know about these groups and workshops. And these kind of fellowships, like junior fellowships, are a great way to open up and know more about the network and joint research in Antarctica. So yeah, I just want to point out that the way to engage future generations, it's relies much on these kind of small steps, bringing the gaps together, the groups.
Thanks, Lewis. I think that's an excellent point. Of course, funding is always an issue for science generally, I guess, and especially for those kind of that unattached funding for EMCRs. But yeah, we can certainly make a note that SCAR fellowships are so valuable, and maybe we can think about if we can contribute there in some way. All right, Madeline had a question, and then we've got a couple questions in the chat.
Hey guys, thanks for the talks. So I am a PhD student and like a baby one. And so I didn't know to answer Natasha's kind of prompt. I don't know very much about anything to do with policy making. So, and I would really like to learn more. So I was thinking about like maybe just like an intro to like policy and the interface between scientists, because that's something I would really like to learn more about. And then I think my research aligns mostly with the theme 1. And I really like the idea of the workshops, like the talks, to get people involved with the different research, because I think that would be a great point of networking, because that would also expose a lot of researchers that don't know each other. And so I would really like to get involved with that, and I look forward to learning more about all the research that's going on.
Perfect, Maddie. And Natasha, maybe you want to speak to this, but that like, I think there might be interest in this, certainly learning about policy language and stuff. So, I mean, Ali has also said in the chat that she is pretty keen to learn about more practical ways, you know, in the policy space about writing summaries and treaty language and things like that. So it sounds like there's quite a lot of appetite for that kind of training. Awesome. To come back to one of the questions in the chat, Gabriella has asked about whether we've considered organising a meeting engaging EMCRs more widely. And that's kind of what this is, and I think the majority of people here are EMCRs. Of course, we wanted to make sure all of our anti-icon steering committee was present to make, you know, so that you all know that they're very keen to get as many EMCRs involved as possible, and that they will support us to do that. And we did, of course, send this to Apex, and Apex did send it out and put it on their Twitter and everything like that. And of course, we'll share the recordings and ask Apex to share the recordings and everything as well. But of course, it is hard to reach all backgrounds, but we did try.
And I just add on to that, it's our intention to actually collect all of these poll questions that we're putting to you, who are a great group, but a small group, and perhaps not necessarily a representative group with respect to the polar EMCR community. So we intend to send those out to the anti-icon mailing list, and perhaps we can even think about other mailing lists if possible, just to get an idea again, of building from the ground up. What are the ways in which Anticon can best serve this community? And of course, that could reach more people than would be available at the this meeting itself. So that's just one of the ways in which we hope to expand the impact of this particular meeting.
Perfect. Thanks, Gilda. Of course, keep putting those questions or thoughts and everything in the chat. That is wonderful. And then talking about, we can maybe talk a little bit about the funding question. Of course, Anticon doesn't have that much funding as all the SRPs. We do have a little bit, and you know, one of our main aims with that is to support EMCRs. So I think it's good to know that everyone's really interested in that, and good to know that you're more interested in things like small research grants and workshops than in travel support, which has actually kind of been the main model so far. Has anyone got any other ideas about, you know, opportunities that we can create either with or without funding? Of course, you know, online workshops and stuff we can do with very little funding at all. No, or any other thoughts or questions? Otherwise, we can probably start to wrap up soon.
This is just a silly question, but could the funding be pushed towards publishing fees to get the unpublished works more accessible?
That is a great question, and that is something that Steve, Natasha, Gilda, and I actually talked about the other day. I know it's something that ECRs and EMCRs especially struggle with, is like publishing money. And unfortunately, we're thinking, given the fact that open access costs so much, like, you might be looking at $5,000 per paper, like that, I just don't think is within Anticlones' budget, given that, we'd only be able to fund a couple of papers a year and then we would have blown our budget. So I don't think that's an option, but it is maybe something that the wider community and SCAR community can maybe think about a bit more, because I recognize it's definitely a challenge. And on behalf of Theme 2, while we're at it, sorry, Natasha, I'll let you go in a sec. I was going to say, Kevin and I are very interested, and Andy, about having as many of you as possible involved in Theme 2, talking about human impacts and sustainability. So if you've got any ideas about what we can do in that space, please raise your hand or put it in the chat too. All right, over to you, Natasha.
No, I was just going to say, just in terms of like the science policy interaction, it's kind of interesting with that open access thing, because you've, like, say here in New Zealand, we've got government agencies who are funding research, but then the research that they're funding, then at the end of it, is put into a publication that they can't even have access to. So it's kind of ironic, and I wonder if there's a bigger thing at play that needs to change as well, like institutionally. Yeah, because it just seems a bit ironic to me. But thanks for that comment. It wasn't stupid.
No, yeah, it was a great question. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I think this is a systemic science problem. It's certainly not unique to Anticlone or, EMCRs in general. All right, Daniela.
Thanks, Jasmine. I just wanted to add to the question about the possibility of us funding a publishing fee. I think this is an important point to note, that we should, I think, also communicate to the SCAR executive, but it has already been raised within SCAR, within the ExCom and amongst the delegates, that we need to be much more flexible with how we award what we formally set aside for travel funding, which again was not insubstantial either. So I think there are options there, and I'll make another mental note of that, and we'll bring it up again when I've got the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Brilliant, Daniela. That sounds like a great plan. Oops, sorry, I unmuted my wrong one. All right, and Joanna has said in the chat, just to follow up, that SCAR can be more flexible with how funds are allocated too. So that's great, coming from the SCAR Secretariat. Any other questions or thoughts or comments, or anyone else from Anticlone Steering Committee here that wants to say anything? All right, we've got a question in the chat, and I'm not sure who would be best placed to answer this. Maybe Joanna, if you are there. It's, does SCAR provide any funding or fellowships for experienced researchers, say those who have more than 8 years experience after PhD and are currently not working?
I just unmute myself here. Thank you for the question. So we do have 2 programs, the fellowship program that you mentioned, but then also the visiting scholar program, which might be a good idea in that case, because this is really specifically aimed at mid to late career researchers. The deadline for this is actually tomorrow, so it's very, very short notice, but this is definitely an option we do have where we provide funding.
Can I just jump in there and add to that, that within different SCAR groups, there are also potential opportunities available. I mean, obviously, most of the groups will focus on early career researchers to hand out their money to them in order to build the community of Antarctic researchers and build capacity. But that doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for established researchers to make a good case, to pursue certain angles of research, or maybe even to run an action group, propose an action group or an expert group. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Daniela. That was a really worthwhile addition as well, because we do always encourage the groups to really make use of their budget, and whether this is involving someone for a specific project, or yeah, providing support for early career researchers or late career researchers, it's definitely worth getting in touch with the group leaders.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniela and Joanna. Is there any other comments or questions? And of course, I mean, if you think of anything else later on, feel free to email it through to anyone on the Anticlone Steering Committee, yeah, or put it on Twitter. Right, I think that's all that everyone said so far. So unless anyone's got anything else, I will wrap up. Is there anything else from anyone on the steering committee? No. Oh, Kevin.
Can I just say that just to reflect a little bit, that I've been in polar research for quite a long time now, and whenever I first started out, we didn't have a faintest clue about policy. It wasn't something that was talked about. It was something that was kind of done by people way up there on the top of the pile, and you know, we didn't think about it. We didn't try and influence it. We didn't do any research to try and necessarily to push it in any given direction. All of that has to change now. Antarctica is under so much threat, and under climate change, human impact, so many different things are happening. We really do need early career and middle career researchers to be involved, because you guys are the future, and it's important that you contribute, you know, for the future. So just wanted to kind of say that, but thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think we're really well placed as EMCRs now to get involved, and I think there is a huge appetite for us to be involved, and that's certainly what I've found. So I think if you are keen to try and contribute to policy, there's definitely options, and there's definitely people out there that want to help you with that, starting with us. So yeah, definitely. That was really well said. All right, I think I'll wrap everything up there. Thanks everyone for attending today. It's been a really great meeting, and a massive thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you for outlining all of Anticlone's aims, objectives and goals. And I'll just reiterate one more time, please get in touch with us in any format that's easiest for you, whether that's email or Twitter, or even just, yeah, drop us a line if you'd like to chat online or anything like that. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you soon.